Alright, so today we're going to be talking about layout sketches, and just to preface, layout sketches are pretty controversial, especially in FTC. Some people think that you should do it, some people don't, and there are a lot of different ways to do it, but I'd say that it is, in general, a good practice. Now, what are layout sketches? So, after you decide what your robot is going to do, what mechanisms it's going to have, how they're going to work together to accomplish the game tasks, you use a layout sketch to define the spacing and placement of those mechanisms. In other words, you define general high-level structure of your robot without getting too much into the nitty-gritty details. Now, layout sketch is generally done as a team rather than by a single individual, and I'll get to that later. But moving on, why should you use a layout sketch? It's mainly to make integration easier. If you CAD a bunch of things independently, especially if you have multiple people on your CAD team, it becomes very hard to make things fit together. And so layout sketches aim to help with that by having a single source of truth that team members can refer to as they CAD their individual parts of the robot, and that is to make sure that everything fits together in the end. Now let's talk about some general guidelines for making a layout sketch. So the first thing is that your layout sketches have to be contained in one part studio, and that part studio has to be very accessible so that it's easy for people to get to and refer to as they are making parts of the robot. And so probably you want it outside of any folder and just right up in everyone's faces, kind of. Next, the layout sketch part studio obviously should only contain sketches. Do not have any parts in there because layout sketches can already get pretty cluttered up as is, and you don't want any additional parts that aren't even supposed to be there further cluttering up your layout sketch. And finally, make sure that your layout sketch can be derived into whatever part studio you are using to make your custom parts. And so that way you can, use your source of truth as a basis for whatever parts you are making so that you are sure that your parts reflect whatever you and your team have agreed on in the layout sketch. Now, let's talk about some of the things that you should have in your layout sketch to properly define your robot. So, number one, your robot superstructure. So this is whatever the parts you have in your robot that connect your mechanisms together and define the overall size of your robot. And you also obviously want your mechanisms in the layout sketch. So this would be large things like arms, slides, your drivetrain, that kind of stuff. And next, you also want your motors in your layout sketch, because motors are actually pretty big relative to the size of FTC robots, so you definitely want that in there so that you are accounting for the space that they take up. Next, control and expansion hubs. Obviously, like the battery, they are going to be in your robot. They have to be. You don't really have a choice there. And given they are actually pretty big, you should definitely have that in your layout sketch as well. And finally, you should probably have your scoring or game elements somewhere in your layout sketch. Now, for the optional and sometimes items, servos. So servos are really annoying to put in layout sketches, and they really clutter things up. They are useful, and sometimes you maybe should put them if you are in a really space-constrained area, just so you know that everything fits, but it's not necessary. Next thing, sensors and odometries. These are both small things that you can probably fit anywhere. If you are really concerned about packaging, again, you should probably put these in, but for most people, this won't be necessary to put in a layout sketch. And finally, power transmission paths. So this kind of depends on how specific or obvious it is. So for some things, like if you are making a go build a strafer drivetrain, and you know that you are just going to have a set of miter gears driving each wheel, you don't really need to model that in because you kind of know, it's assumed. But if you have you're powering an arm and there's a very specific ratio, then you should probably put that in your layout sketch. Next, let's talk about your workflow for making your layout sketch. Again, I've broken this up into two sections: need and optional or sometimes. So in need, we have top and side sketches. Those are the two sketches that usually give you the most utility, and those are the ones you should definitely do. And the next thing in need is having constraints within and across sketches. So by that, what I mean is that if you are first modeling the side sketch and then the top sketch, you want to make sure that your lines and shapes in top sketch reflect the sizes of the things in the side sketch. And so that way your sketches are more parametric, and if you ever need to make changes, you won't have to make changes to both sketches. And now in optional, or sometimes we have a front sketch. Sometimes it's useful, sometimes it's not, and having different sketches for each mechanism. This choice is usually dictated by how complex a mechanism is. For example, if you have one mechanism that is very, very complex and is taking up a lot of space in your layout sketch, you probably want to make a different sketch for it just so it doesn't become very hard to understand what each sketch is showing you. Now, let's look at an example of an actual layout sketch and see how it reflects these principles. So here, as you can see, I have a side and top layout sketch for a robot for the Into the Deep game. It looks pretty cluttered, but I've tried to stick, for the most part, to the guidelines I mentioned earlier on what to include and what to neglect. So let's take first a look at the side sketch. And so some things of note here is, one, that I have modeled the power transmission both for my linear slides and also for my pivot. And so the reason for this is that these are non-standard gear ratios, and it's not super clear otherwise how power is being transmitted from one place to another. So it becomes important for me to put that in there just so the viewer kind of has an idea how this power is being transmitted. But you will notice also that there is no CAD on the gears that connect the drivetrain motors here to the wheel, because that is kind of implied, and I don't really need to show that explicitly to the viewer, as it's just kind of adding to the clutter of the sketch. Now, the next thing up is that I've also made the arm and servo pivot kind of movable. I haven't fully constrained them, so you can move it around and kind of observe the degrees of freedom that this robot has. Note that I haven't done the same for the linear slides that are mounted on this pivot, right around here. And that brings us to our final point. I have modeled, or at least just given a general outline of the scoring bucket and also the sample that the robot is holding here. Now, let's take a look at the top sketch. Okay, so to be honest, my top sketch is not exactly the best. In retrospect, I probably could have tried to make it less crammed, probably by dividing this up into sketches for the drivetrain, a sketch for the arm, linear slide, and intake. That would probably have made things simpler and less messy. But on the other hand, you can see that I have included the outlines for the hubs over here and here, and also I know that the battery is going to be inside this U-channel in this space here. And so that's something that you should make sure you do, because fitting hubs on a robot after everything else has already been designed and built is massive pain, and you should definitely try to avoid that by getting this out of the way as soon as possible. Hopefully this video was helpful in getting you to understand and appreciate layout sketches, and hopefully you'll be able to use one in your future CAD whenever you're making your next robot. But thank you for watching.